This is session 2 of 5, and it's about regulatory response to risks related to climate change and risk management. It will feature Stephanie Meyer, who will discuss regulatory response to risks associated with climate change, and Daniel Clear, who will talk about climate risk management and disclosure. There has been a marked increase in focus from regulators on the climate topic in the last few years. In particular, from the central bank's perspective, in 2017, the Network for Greening the Financial System was established, which was a voluntary group of organizations across the world looking at how to think about climate risk management in the context of managing financial stability. So far, there are 94 members and 15 observers looped into the group, and they've made significant progress on establishing what a scenario could look like for the financial system to manage the risks related to financial stability, namely transition risks, physical risks. In addition, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is all about bringing transparency across the sector in how climate risks are managed and how they are addressed. More than 1,500 organisations are supporting this initiative, and we expect its findings to become mandatory in many locations. The UK, for example, has noted that it will adopt mandatory disclosure by 2023. The recommendations for the task force include setting adequate governance structures, risk management, looking at metrics and targets. And that's particularly helpful because it provides a uniform response to thinking about climate change. The TCFD is aimed at all sectors, and it helps to bring a consistent and standardized approach to thinking across this topic. But for now, I'll hand over to Stephanie Meyer.
The board is where a lot of these strategic decisions and sort of challenge needs to take place. So it's great to be to have this opportunity to sort of talk through some of not just the what's coming down the line, but what's probably firmly on your table, and to work through, I think, some of the practical aspects of how can support the companies in the transition that's necessary. So as Daniel said, he sort of set out the increase in focus from the regulators. A number of you will be familiar with the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, which again set out a voluntary framework for disclosures for both companies and financial institutions. And it's essentially this structure that the Bank of England have taken forward and included in their supervisory statement of, I think it was April last year, where they essentially outlined how both banks and insurers should view these risks and how they may look at both the governance, the risk management, scenario analysis, and disclosure. So I'll just briefly sort of touch on each of those. So, within governance, I mean, this is essentially, the role of the board and obviously the important part that non-executives play. I suppose the two key areas there is around the capacity building, the understanding, again, both, climate science, but obviously importantly what it means for your businesses. But also with that understanding and sort of capacity building, it's how some of those strategic decisions are able to be challenged, and also inform the sort of overarching risk appetite, and that's one of the areas that was highlighted by the Bank of England around discussion and governance around the risk appetite statement around climate change in particular, and then obviously the clear roles and responsibilities. If we go on to the second column and the sort of risk management element, again, banks in financial institutions are often highly regulated, and so there's a lot of existing risk management regimes already in place. But what was very clear in the statement was really that process around the specific risk identification, risk monitoring, and risk management. So again, obviously on a number of boards there may be separate committee that looks at this in more detail, but again, at the board overall, it's really ensuring that this is appropriately incorporated into the risk management processes. The third area is scenario analysis, and I'll go into a bit more detail shortly around what do we mean, what scenarios, but essentially this is how do we explore exactly those dimensions that Daniel outlined around transition risk and the physical risks, and clearly the interdependency between those two. Now we know that broadly the transition risk is around the impact of policymakers, of technology costs coming down, etc. But there are multiple paths to decarbonize. There are multiple stringencies of policy ambition. We have Paris agreement was the well below 1.5 degrees. We know the current Paris commitments don't get us to that point. So there's a lot of variability, and scenario analysis is a very effective way of exploring that uncertainty to build resilience into the business strategy, but is also being used as a regulatory tool to ensure that the regulators have a better understanding of how prepared banks and insurance companies in particular are for the transition and physical risks associated with climate change. And then the last pillar is disclosure. And again, as you've heard, there's a lot of focus on this disclosure, regulatory disclosure, but also public disclosure. A number of banks, financial institutions are themselves listed companies. And therefore, this move that we're seeing from the sort of voluntary to the mandatory TCFD aligned reporting across multiple jurisdictions is certainly something that we expect to become much more prominent. And Daniel mentioned I'm on the global steering committee and helped to set up the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative. That is a global investor initiative, 400 plus investors, trillion under management, and focused on the high emitting sector, so 161 companies in oil and gas, materials, etc. But essentially the three asks around how is the company governing climate risk, how is the company aligning its business strategy with the Paris goals and the trajectory that we're seeing in terms of decarbonisation, and how does it disclose, is essentially the same principles that you may expect to hear questions around from your shareholders and bondholders. So if we move to the next slide, we have here, or when we get there, you will see, oh, perfect. We'll see the three exploratory scenarios that the Bank of England published for its biennial exploratory scenario sort of exercise. So this is essentially where the Bank of England specifies scenarios to help understand how resilient, how prepared banks are for a number of different scenarios. And the focus for this year was to be climate change, and they've set out three scenario narratives, as you can see there. Early policy action, so again you can imagine that will have much more immediate impacts, but is more likely to get us to the temperature target. Late policy action, which again means there's less sort of shorter term impact, but then one would expect a much more significant, sort of much sharper repricing sort of event. And then the last one is the sort of no policy action, where again the risks are less on the transition side and more on the physical side. Now these are the ones from the Bank of England. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the NGFS, which we've spoken about, published their own set of scenarios, public scenarios driven from a number of different models, but essentially exploring the same sort of three areas: a sort of hothouse world, which is essentially no kind of current policies, no new action; the disorderly and the orderly transition, and sort of pulling the physical risk element into that as well. So I think we're likely to see we have already seen specific regulators put forward their own scenarios for banks and insurers to stress against and to report against. We're also seeing I think from within NGFS, a desire to put a lot of those scenarios into the public domain. So there is perhaps a bit more alignment around the types of policy, around the types of scenarios that are being used. And then if we go on to the next slide, this is essentially taken from the TCFD report, and then the recommendations that followed. But this is once the scenario analysis has been undertaken, what does this mean really? What's the financial impact? What's the financial impact on the risk side, on the opportunity side? What does it mean in terms of the impacts of these different businesses? Now, if you're talking about a oil and gas company, or a materials company, or an auto company, then you have a clearly a very good understanding of your own product line, capex decisions, kind of strategic direction for your products and services. When we take that into financial institutions, clearly the challenge becomes, in one degree, a lot more complex, because it is around lending to multiple businesses that will each face their own risks and opportunities depending on their product mix, on their business, on the markets they're operating in, etc. Similarly for asset owners and asset managers, essentially what we're looking at stressing, or at exploring within scenario analysis, is really how do we build resilient portfolios throughout, and to help drive this low carbon transition. So it is certainly complex, but I think it's helpful to understand the sort of building blocks which are set out here. And then if we go on to the next slide, these are some of the, I suppose, the early learnings and lessons learned so far. And I'll pass over to Daniel shortly, just to go over again a bit more of the insight from his work chairing one of the climate risk committees that recently published some excellent guidance in this area. But these sort of lessons ring true from the work we've done on our own scenario analysis and sort of integration of climate risk. So the first one, it is about integration. So this isn't a separate exercise, as you will have seen from the supervisory statement. It's really about how do you build climate into your existing governance, risk management processes. Toned from the top, obviously key. We know that, which is why this initiative is so critical. Again, it is an evolving area, and interestingly, the guidance come out has made it clear, even within financial institutions, how you manage risks as a bank, or as an insurer, or as an asset manager is different, because we're exposed to different risks in different ways. But we really need to sort of get under the bonnet to understand and explore what those risks and opportunities mean for our businesses. Data, this clearly comes up a lot, and is indeed a challenge. TCFD is there to address in part that data gap that we have, and there's numerous sort of data solutions that are springing up. But again, there's a lot of data that is accessible within businesses, and how do you harness that, and how do you make a start, recognizing that this we're not going to be at some perfect endpoint, or if we are, it will be too late. So it really is about getting started with the meaningful, useful data that's available now. And the last point, I think, is probably a good point at which to pass over to Daniel to go over some of the again, additional questions that are key for boards to address and to talk through.
I just want to stay on this page for a minute and give everyone a bit more context for those in the UK, but also for those in other countries. I think it's quite helpful to see what the Bank of England has done. The Bank of England, between the PRA and the FCA, they've created something that they call the Climate Financial Risk Forum, which was a forum hosted by the Bank of England, but inviting industry participants to essentially come up with answers to the problems that we are facing. So the Bank of England set up 4 working groups, one on climate risk management, one on disclosure, one on scenario analysis, and one on innovation. And I've asked industry participants to chair these groups. So I was chairing the climate risk working group. And I think the lessons here were just some of the outputs of that work. There's a very detailed guide. There's a summary paper, which is about 25 pages, which I think we've circulated a link to those ahead. But then also there are specific guides for each of these 4 chapters. And I think really that the first point was quite key. When we started this discussion, I think most institutions acknowledge that at the moment they have somebody looking at something like sustainability risk or sometimes reputational risk. But to be really effective in this space, you have to integrate this into the way we run normal financial risk. And when we looked at this at HSBC, we did that about 2.5 years ago. We took climate risk out of the reputational risk corner and put it into the normal financial risk area, and suddenly becomes real, because many of our institutions are very good in managing credit risk, managing market risk, managing operational risk, but you need to give people the mandate to do it. I think the second one is absolutely critical. This topic is hard. This topic is very often beyond the normal planning horizon of every organization. And this is about a 2-decade-long transition. And I think many of you will have heard Carney talk about the tragedy of the horizons, and Sarah Breeden from the Bank of England talks about the system mispricing climate risk because we don't look far ahead enough. And I think that also brings me to the data challenge. A lot of institutions are worried how to deal with this because it is really difficult to run a 30-year stress test without good data. But one thing that I think our regulators use quite often here, which I think is actually a good paraphrasing of what we have to do here, is it's not about the perfect math exam. It's about writing a good English essay. Because what we want to do in the first instance is actually understand dynamics in our portfolio, understand how the business would react in certain scenarios. It is not so important at this point to understand the exact number. It's important to understand how our business models will perform in different scenarios. And I think that's really where the board is so important. This is an engagement process, and it's about asking the right questions. And we put a few of the questions that are also published in this climate financial risk guide here on this page. It's about understanding what's actually an institution's risk appetite. What is material? And I think what's material is very different for different institutions. In this working group, we had building societies as well as large insurance companies that cover global portfolios. The types of risks that you're facing are very, very different. Then the question, what is actually the current exposure? So at HSBC, just as an example, we looked at our wholesale portfolio and we worked through different filters. Where do we see significant transition risk? Where do we see regulatory actions? Where do we have large exposures? And essentially for us, it boiled down to 6 sectors that we call high transition risk sectors, where we have significant exposure and we expect significant change. And those are the ones that you would expect: oil and gas, utilities, metals and mining, chemicals, construction, and the transportation sector. But if you are a bank that is more a UK building society, the big portion is in residential mortgages. If you are an institution that is more exposed to agriculture, you will have the material exposure in that field. And so I think it's really important to look through the current exposure, the current business model, and understand where will climate risk actually hit and what are the areas. And then on the right side of the page, how do you actually embed this in the way you run governance, in the way you train the organization? Is it part of the 3 lines of defense framework? Is it part of the incentive structures? Because the only way for this to become part of the DNA of an organization is to hardwire it. And I think that's an important role for the board to start this hardwiring into governance and into the way we run organizations, especially with something that is sort of a 15, 30-year time horizon. It is important to do this now.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Daniel. Again, a lot of useful and interesting messages. I would like to focus the attention of my fellow directors, especially on 2 points. Firstly, I cannot stress enough the need for the right tone from the top. And this goes from the chairman of the board to the whole board and the CEO. down throughout the whole company, and it really needs to be hardwired in the organization, in its strategy and its DNA. Secondly, as we talk about risk, and I'm always keen to stress that climate change is not just about risk, it's also about opportunities. But if we stay on risk, climate change touches on all the risks that the financial institutions faces. And as such, it needs to be considered. Credit risk, market risk, liquidity, as well as operational, legal, litigation, reputational, political risk. As the most recent evidence on how regulators are tackling these risks, on June 23rd, the European Banking Authority published a report on the management and supervision of ESG risks, in which climate and environmental risks have a very prominent role. It provides uniform definitions and appropriate quantitative and qualitative criteria for the assessment of the impact of ESG risks on the financial stability of institutions across different time horizons. It covers strategy, somewhat governance, internal control, risk framework, KPI, and also linked to remuneration. Also following the blueprint of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, but tailoring it to the financial sector. It should be noted that the European Banking Authority will publish Pillar 3 disclosure requirements on ESG risks, and especially transition and physical risks, later this year. And eventually, this will form part of the supervisory review and evaluation process for financial institutions. This follows already a similar assessment undertaken by the Bank of England, and more regulators globally are following this lead. As Zoe mentioned earlier, the Network for Greening the Financial System already accounts for 94 members, central banks and regulators, and 15 observers globally, and is a strong evidence of how central banks and regulators worldwide are increasingly coordinating their efforts, and we should expect more progress from disclosure requirements to soft law to more defined regulations.